The unknown regions are probably the most mysterious and, if you're like me, interesting part of the Star Wars galaxy. In today's Star Wars Legends and Canon lore video, I'm going to explain why the unknown regions are unknown and why exploration of this part of space is so difficult. Hey guys, this is EckhartsLadder. Hello and welcome to another Star Wars lore video. As I mentioned in the introduction today, we are talking about the unknown region and taking an in-depth look at its mystery in both Legends and Canon. Before I continue, I just want to thank everyone who voted for this idea on Twitter. I typically will put my future ideas up for a vote on either Discord or Twitter, so if you want to help choose which episodes get made, make sure to join the Discord and follow me on Twitter. Links down in the description. Anyway, let's talk about the topic. Why is the unknown region still unknown, and why isn't it being actively explored? Let's first look at Star Wars Legends, and there are a ton of great sources in Legends that help out with this very question. Probably the most notable one is the Unknown Regions Guide for the Star Wars RPG. The first thing that I want to mention is that the unknown regions actually are being explored, although it has been at a relatively slow pace. The RPG guide makes very clear that the unknown regions as it existed during the time of the Old Republic was much larger than it was in modern Star Wars history. The Empire especially dedicated a good amount of resources to trying to map out the space. Still, much remained untouched. Why is that? The guide says very simply, cut off by the lack of known hyperspace lanes and the dangers of mapping new routes, the unknown regions remain largely unexplored throughout all eras of galactic history. That sort of answers our question. It tells us that the unknown regions are unknown because they're difficult to map, largely due to the lack of hyperspace lanes. But let's kind of dissect that idea a little bit more. A secondary question that develops after that quote is, why are there not developed hyperspace lanes? And also generally, why has civilization not developed in that area of space such that hyperspace lanes would have developed alongside of it? In the Imperial era, we can explain it as the Empire is fairly core-centric and pretty xenophobic as well, so it makes sense that they wouldn't dedicate all of their time to trying to establish colonies outside of what they already have. However, there has been a divide between the unknown regions and the rest of the galaxy throughout all of galactic history. Much of this comes from the stellar geography of the galaxy. Specifically, the unknown region is full of dangers, black holes, gravitational anomalies, other things like that, things that make it difficult to plot hyperspace lanes. In particular, we know of the Tangle, and I also got this from the Unknown Regions RPG guide. It says that entering the unknown regions from within the galactic disk requires a trip through a chaotic web of hyperspace interference referred to as the Tangle. The irregularly shaped Tangle extends many light years into the western region of the galactic disk. So this is sort of a catch-22. Think of how regions and really on a grander scale countries develop in the real world. You see cities popping up along common trade routes, whether it's a natural one, something like a river, or an artificial one, like train tracks. The Star Wars civilization and the key points within the Star Wars galaxy largely developed around hyperspace lanes. For a hyperspace lane to exist, it needs to be clear of things like gravitational anomalies, because hyperspace jumps are impossible with those stellar phenomenon existing. On a macro galactic scale, we also have super hyperspace lanes. Hydian Way, for example, is the major hyperspace lane in the Star Wars galaxy, and you can basically use it to travel from galactic north to galactic south. This lane was created thousands and thousands of years before the Battle of Yavin. However, it had a major effect on galactic politics, on galactic hotspots, and really just the general development of the galaxy as a whole. Planets that were near this major hyperspace lane obviously received a lot of attention and became very important. Because it's difficult to establish hyperspace lanes going through the galactic west, much of the unknown regions remains, to be honest, relatively unimportant. This issue is made worse by the fact that many hyperspace lanes were developed tens of thousands of years before the Battle of Yavin. At such a time, advanced hyperspace navigation would have been even more difficult. So what we have is that hyperspace navigation is not impossible, but it is difficult. And at this point, where galactic politics and just the setting of the galaxy has been established for so long, and there are still so many locations closer to major hyperspace lanes, really there just isn't the necessity to explore that part of the galaxy. Along with that, the unknown regions are very dangerous. I mean, besides for the stellar phenomenon that we've been talking about throughout this part of the video, we also have more tangible dangers. Things like very territorial but also very powerful empires like the Chiss, the Cyru, or countless others. So when venturing into the unknown regions, not only do you have to either plan your own hyperspace jump or rely on questionable calculations from somewhere else without official sources, but you also have to deal with whatever dangers are lurking on the other side of your jump. The Star Wars galaxy is huge, and there are so many fertile locations still left unexplored, and just generally, unless you're some sort of smuggler, deviant, or other person trying to escape the law, there isn't a whole lot of reason to venture into the unknown regions. Aside from things like black holes or the Kilix or the Chiss, we also have to deal with things like the Nal Nal or other ancient, not fully understood terrors. It seems that even the Chiss, for example, were somewhat aware that the Yuuzhan Vong were lurking somewhere in the unknown regions, although they referred to them as the Far Outsiders. Threats like that existed, as did countless others that, just to be honest, unless you lived in the unknown regions your entire life, you likely wouldn't be prepared for. It seems like the Hyperspace Disturbance, which stops travel from outside of the galaxy, also bisects part of the unknown regions, although this isn't fully clear to me. This would make travel even more dangerous. We don't fully know what happens when you go through this hyperspace disturbance. Certainly it appears to be fatal at hyperspace speeds, but it appears to even be dangerous at sublight speeds as well. Additionally, we need to consider the development of hyperspace travel itself. Much of hyperspace development, although really the Rakatans were among the first, happened within the core worlds, and where early hyperspace technology was very rudimentary, much of this travel was just between nearby systems. This kind of had the effect of the oldest and thus most explored hyperspace lanes being more predisposed to being towards the center of the galaxy. Finally, and this is the last thing I'm going to mention, at least for Star Wars Legends, it's really not possible for an individual to do something like mapping out the unknown regions. It's really something that requires an empire or some other government to do so, and most empires, except at times the New Republic and the Empire, didn't really have the need or the want to do so. It also appears that by the late Legacy era of Star Wars Legends that there was literally no interest in mapping the unknown regions, and that they'd been largely ignored. Let's look now at Star Wars canon, and just off the bat we can assume that most of the things that we've said about the unknown region, except perhaps the hyperspace barrier around the galaxy and some of the more esoteric things, are probably the same. We don't know for certain, but it's likely that hyperspace developed in a similar way with a preference towards core worlds, and that because of the gravitational anomalies and other stellar events in the unknown region, that major hyperspace lanes aren't really feasible. We do, however, get a good discussion of the issue within both the Thrawn book and perhaps more prominently the Aftermath trilogy. There we learn that like Legends, there is some force, whether it's gravitational or something stranger, that makes travel throughout this part of the galaxy very, very difficult. I will say that the unknown regions actually seem more difficult to navigate within Star Wars canon. We know, for example, that most of the galaxy thought that the Chiss were legends, even those who lived within the unknown region are wild space, and travel generally just seems much more difficult. I'm going to, right now, include a snippet from Aftermath, which talks about the difficulty of exploring not only the unknown regions, but outside of the Star Wars galaxy.
For decades, these computers have been plotting a journey. Outside the known galaxy is an unexplored infinity, Palpatine explained. One closed off by a labyrinth of solar storms, rogue magnetospheres, black holes, gravity wells, and things far stranger. Any who tried to conquer that maze did not survive. The ships were obliterated or returned to the galaxy devoid of travelers. Communications from those explorers were incomprehensible, either shot through with such static as to make the content useless, or filled with enough inane babble to serve as a perfectly clear sign that the explorer had gone utterly mad out there in isolation.
People have often asked, well, why not just use probe droids to map this area of the galaxy? There are a couple of answers to that. The first is that it's extremely difficult to do and requires a lot of resources. It also requires a lot of computation power. We know that even simple hyperspace jumps take several minutes to compute, and mapping a large portion of the galaxy obviously needs a lot of resources. However, mapping the galaxy with probe droids is exactly what Palpatine appears to have done, and Seems like the First Order, moving into the sequel trilogy, actually used that knowledge and those maps to somehow set themselves up away from Republic scrutiny. We also know that the Emperor's Super Star Destroyer Eclipse was hidden in the unknown region somewhere, and at the end of the Aftermath trilogy, we see that several Imperials are on their way to find it. Generally though, the same considerations apply. The Empire and other governments most likely were fairly core-centric, much of the galaxy was already developed, the hyperspace lanes kind of dictate the popular areas within the Star Wars galaxy, and there's really no need to explore what is unknown, dangerous, and just not easy to venture into. Anyways guys, that's my explanation and my primer on exploring the unknown regions in both Legends and Canon. I really hope that you guys enjoyed this episode. I consider the unknown regions to be one of my favorite parts of Star Wars Legends, and it's probably the part which I've spent the most time researching and reading about. If you want to learn more, I suggest that you pick up the Star Wars Legends Unknown Region RPG supplement. To be honest, much of it's not that relevant unless you're playing the Star Wars tabletop RPG, but it still goes over in some depth the region itself, the species in that region, and several important aspects of the unknown region and wild space generally. I also suggest that you read the new Aftermath trilogy along with the Thrawn book, and that you go back and check out the Outbound flight from Star Wars Legend. Anyways, this has been your host, EckhartsLadder. Thank you guys so much for watching, and hey, as always, may the Force be with you.